When we say that narcissistic sexuality is driven by validation rather than intimacy, we are talking about a fundamental difference in motivation. In healthy sexuality, intimacy is about connection. It is about mutual vulnerability, shared pleasure, emotional safety, and feeling seen. It is not just physical contact, it is relational contact. But in a narcissistic dynamic, sex often serves a different psychological purpose. It becomes a mirror, a stage, a source of ego reinforcement. For a narcissistic personality, the core emotional driver is the need for admiration and affirmation. There is often a fragile internal sense of self that depends heavily on external validation. Attention, desire, and sexual admiration become powerful sources of reassurance. Being wanted is not just flattering, it is regulating, it soothes insecurity, it confirms superiority. It reinforces identity. This is why, especially at the beginning of a relationship, sexual intensity can feel overwhelming and intoxicating. The pursuit may be relentless, the chemistry may feel electric, you may feel uniquely desired, deeply chosen, even idealized. But that intensity is often less about mutual discovery and more about securing supply. Emotional supply, admiration supply, validation supply. The more you desire them, the more powerful and affirmed they feel. In that early stage, sexuality can feel almost cinematic. Grand gestures, strong passion, intense focus, but beneath it, the unspoken question driving the dynamic is, do you want me? Do you admire me? Do I still have power here? The sexual connection becomes a measurement tool. It is not how close are we, but how admired am I. Over time, this motivation begins to shape the experience. Because when sex is about validation, it becomes performance-based. It becomes something to win at, to dominate, to perfect. The focus may shift toward how they appear, how skilled they seem, how desirable they are perceived to be, rather than whether you feel safe, connected, or emotionally present. You may begin to notice that emotional depth during intimacy feels limited. There may be physical closeness but emotional distance. Eye contact without real presence, passion without tenderness, or moments that feel scripted rather than shared. That emptiness is not accidental. It reflects the underlying motivation. If the goal is validation, then the emotional exchange is secondary. Another important layer is that validation-driven sexuality often lacks true empathy. Empathy requires attunement, noticing subtle cues, caring about our comfort, adjusting based on your needs. But if the primary focus is self-enhancement, empathy may feel inconsistent or shallow. Your pleasure might matter if it reinforces their image. Your needs might be considered if they enhance their performance, but if your vulnerability requires slowing down, softening, or shifting the focus away from them, it can create discomfort. This is where confusion sets in for partners. You might think, but they seem passionate, they seem confident, they seem experienced, and all of that may be true. But passion is not the same as intimacy. Confidence is not the same as connection. Experience is not the same as empathy. In validation-driven sexuality, sexual access can also become a symbol of control. Being desired is powerful. Being pursued is affirming, and being able to withhold intimacy can feel equally powerful. The dynamic may subtly shift into a reward system. When you are affirming and compliant, intimacy may be available. When you challenge or assert yourself, distance may appear. The sexual connection becomes tied to ego balance rather than relational harmony. You might also notice hypersensitivity around rejection. If you are tired, distracted, or not in the mood, the response may feel disproportionate. Hurt may quickly turn into irritation or withdrawal. Because refusal is not just about timing, it is experienced as a threat to self-worth. If sex is a primary source of validation, then any disruption to it can feel destabilizing. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful emotional environment. You may begin to feel responsible for regulating their self-esteem through intimacy. You may feel pressure to perform, to reassure, to respond in ways that protect their ego. And in doing so, your own experience can slowly disappear. The hardest part is that validation-driven sexuality can look glamorous from the outside. It can appear confident, magnetic, even addictive. But inside the relationship, it may feel lonely, because intimacy is not about being admired. It is about being known. And being known requires emotional risk, humility, and genuine care, qualities that are often limited in narcissistic dynamics. When sex becomes a tool for ego reinforcement rather than mutual connection, it loses its grounding. It becomes transactional rather than relational, and if you consistently walk away from intimacy feeling unseen, anxious, or emotionally unfulfilled, that feeling is important. It is not a sign that you are needy, it is information about the underlying motivation driving the dynamic. Real intimacy expands both people. Validation-driven sexuality centers one, and that difference changes everything. In the early stages of a relationship with a narcissistic personality, the sexual intensity can feel extraordinary. It can feel passionate, consuming, and deeply affirming. You may experience a level of attention and desire that feels almost surreal. The chemistry may seem undeniable, the attraction may feel magnetic, and the connection may move very quickly, with little hesitation or gradual development. This early intensity is not random. It often reflects what is known as the idealization phase. During this phase, you are not simply being appreciated, you are being elevated. You may be described as perfect, unlike anyone they have ever met, the most attractive partner they have ever had. Compliments may be constant, physical affection may be abundant, the sexual connection may feel urgent and powerful. At first, this feels flattering, it feels validating, it can feel like you have finally found someone who truly sees you and wants you fully. But in many narcissistic dynamics, this intensity serves a psychological purpose beyond romance or desire. It functions to secure attachment quickly. It creates emotional bonding at an accelerated pace. It strengthens your investment in the relationship before you have had time to assess it carefully. Sexual intensity during idealization often has an almost theatrical quality. It may feel larger than life. There may be grand gestures, dramatic expressions of desire, and overwhelming pursuit. This can create a sense of destiny, a belief that this connection is rare, exceptional, and uniquely powerful. The speed itself becomes part of the seduction, but intensity is not the same as intimacy. Intimacy develops gradually. It grows through shared experiences, emotional vulnerability, consistency, and trust over time. Intensity, on the other hand, can be manufactured quickly. It can be fueled by fantasy, projection, and ego needs. During idealization, you are often seen less as a complex human being and more as a reflection of what they need you to represent. You may represent status, beauty, admiration, success, or emotional supply. Your desirability becomes a resource. The more attractive or impressive you are, the more validating the conquest feels. Sexual connection in this stage can feel deeply affirming because it is saturated with attention. But the attention is often tied to the thrill of pursuit. There is excitement in winning you, impressing you, captivating you. And once that victory feels secure, the intensity can begin to shift. One of the most confusing aspects of this phase is how genuine it can seem. The passion may feel real, the compliments may feel heartfelt, and in many ways the experience is real in that moment. But it is often driven by emotional hunger rather than relational stability. Narcissistic personalities may idealize partners in order to stabilize their own fragile sense of self. When they see you as extraordinary, they feel extraordinary for having you. Your admiration reinforces their identity. The sexual intensity becomes a powerful feedback loop. You desire them, they feel validated. They pursue you intensely, you feel special. The cycle strengthens attachment. Because of this, boundaries can blur early. Conversations about exclusivity, long-term commitment, or emotional depth may happen quickly. You may feel swept into something that seems profound but has not yet had time to mature. And here is the difficult part. When the idealization phase fades, as it inevitably does, the contrast can feel devastating. The same person who once seemed insatiable in their desire may become distant. The same intensity that once felt overwhelming may disappear. This shift is not because you changed. It is because the psychological function of the intensity has shifted. Once attachment feels secure, the urgency of pursuit may decline. The validation that was once actively sought may feel obtained. And because the foundation was built on intensity rather than stable intimacy, the relationship can struggle to maintain depth without constant stimulation. Partners often internalize this change. They may think, what happened? Why aren't they like they used to be? They may try to recreate the early passion by becoming more accommodating, more attentive, more available. But the early intensity was not simply about chemistry. It was about conquest and validation. This is why the beginning can feel so addictive. It activates powerful emotional and neurological responses: excitement, novelty, dopamine, anticipation. When that intensity pulls back, it can create longing and confusion. You may chase the early version of the relationship, hoping it will return permanently. Understanding this pattern does not mean the early passion was entirely fake. It means it was fueled by a psychological need that is difficult to sustain. Idealization elevates you unrealistically. Real intimacy, in contrast, accepts you realistically. If a relationship begins with overwhelming speed, excessive flattery, and intense sexual bonding that feels almost too good to be true, it is important to slow down. Not to reject passion, but to observe whether it is accompanied by consistency, respect for boundaries, and genuine curiosity about who you are beyond what you provide. True connection deepens over time. It does not burn at maximum intensity from the very first spark. And when sexual energy is used to fast-track attachment, it may feel powerful, but it may not be built to last. One of the most painful shifts in a narcissistic relationship is the slow emergence of emotional emptiness. In the beginning, everything may have felt intense, passionate, even intoxicating. But over time, something begins to change. The physical connection might still exist, the relationship might still look intact from the outside. Yet internally, you start to feel alone. Emotional emptiness does not usually arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly. You may first notice it as a subtle disconnection during intimate moments. You may find yourself thinking, "Why do I feel distant right now?" Or "Why does this feel mechanical?" There may still be chemistry, but the emotional resonance starts to thin out. In healthy intimacy, physical closeness strengthens emotional bonding. After intimacy, you feel calmer, safer, more connected. There is a sense of shared vulnerability, but when emotional emptiness appears, intimacy can feel transactional or one-dimensional. The physical act happens, yet something essential is missing: warmth, attunement, presence. You may begin to notice that your emotional needs are rarely acknowledged. If you try to express longing for deeper connection, the response might feel dismissive, confused, or even irritated. The conversation may quickly shift away from feelings and toward logistics or performance. It becomes difficult to talk about the emotional meaning of intimacy because that depth is uncomfortable in a narcissistic dynamic. Why does this shift happen? In many narcissistic relationships, the early stages are driven by excitement, novelty, and validation. But sustaining emotional depth requires empathy and consistency. It requires the ability to tolerate vulnerability, not just yours, but their own. And that is often where the difficulty lies. True emotional intimacy asks both people to be real. It involves acknowledging insecurities, fears, imperfections. It requires mutual care. But when someone struggles with fragile self-esteem or limited empathy, emotional closeness can start to feel threatening rather than comforting. Pulling back emotionally becomes a way to protect themselves. As that withdrawal happens, the partner often compensates. You may try harder to connect, you may initiate more conversations about feelings, you may increase affection, hoping to revive what once felt natural. But the more you reach, the more distant the dynamic may feel. This creates confusion. You remember the early passion. You remember feeling wanted and admired, so you assume the emotional emptiness must be temporary. You may blame stress, work pressure, or external factors. And while life circumstances can affect any relationship, the persistent pattern of emotional absence is different. It is not occasional disconnection, it is a structural gap. Another aspect of this emptiness is inconsistency. There may still be occasional bursts of warmth or passion, a sudden affectionate evening, a spontaneous intimate moment that feels reminiscent of the beginning. These intermittent highs can be deeply reinforcing. They give hope. They make you believe the connection is still there, just buried. But the inconsistency itself is part of the instability. Emotional security requires reliability. When connection feels unpredictable, your nervous system remains on alert. You may find yourself scanning for signs. Are they distant today? Are they affectionate? Did I do something wrong? This hyper-awareness can be exhausting. Over time, the emotional emptiness can erode self-confidence. You may begin to question your desirability, your emotional needs, even your expectations. You might think, maybe I'm too sensitive, or maybe I'm asking for too much. But wanting emotional presence is not excessive. It is foundational to healthy intimacy. There is also a subtle loneliness that develops. You can be physically close to someone and still feel profoundly alone. You may share a bed, share a life, yet feel unseen in your inner world. Attempts to discuss deeper feelings may feel one-sided or shut down quickly. Conversations that require emotional nuance may be minimized or redirected. What makes this particularly painful is the contrast. You once experienced intensity and closeness. You know what it felt like to be the center of their attention. So the emotional emptiness feels like a loss, not just of connection, but of hope. In some cases, the partner adapts by numbing their own needs. You may stop bringing up emotional concerns because it feels futile. You may focus on practical aspects of the relationship and lower your expectations. But suppressing emotional needs does not make them disappear, it simply pushes them inward. The truth is that sustainable intimacy requires emotional reciprocity. It requires both people to engage not only physically but emotionally. When one person consistently remains detached, guarded, or self-focused, the relationship can begin to feel hollow. Emotional emptiness is not a dramatic explosion. It is the gradual fading of mutual presence. And if you find yourself feeling isolated within intimacy, that feeling is meaningful. It is not a weakness. It is your awareness signaling that connection requires more than proximity. It requires shared emotional investment. Recognizing this shift is difficult, especially when the relationship still functions on the surface. But emotional fulfillment is not optional in a healthy partnership. Without it, closeness becomes a performance rather than a bond. And over time, that absence can weigh heavily on the person who continues to long for depth. When sex becomes a tool for control, reward, or punishment, the entire emotional tone of a relationship shifts. What should be an experience of mutual closeness slowly turns into a system of leverage, and often this shift is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It develops gradually, through patterns that can be difficult to name at first. In a healthy dynamic, intimacy is shared freely. It is not something that must be earned through compliance or withheld to enforce obedience. But in a narcissistic pattern, sex can become part of a power structure. It can function as a currency given when admiration is high, withdrawn when ego feels threatened. You may begin to notice that intimacy feels conditional. When you are agreeable, affirming, and supportive, the connection may feel warm and available. But when you assert a boundary, question behavior, or express dissatisfaction, distance can suddenly appear. Affection cools, desire fades, the shift can feel abrupt and confusing. This creates an unspoken message. Closeness depends on your behavior. Over time, you may internalize this dynamic without even realizing it. You might adjust your tone, soften your opinions. Avoid conflict. Not because you consciously trade compliance for intimacy, but because your nervous system recognizes the pattern. You learn that harmony increases access, while challenge decreases it. This is where sex becomes a reward system. If admiration feeds the narcissistic ego, then intimacy becomes the reinforcement mechanism. When they feel validated, they may feel generous. When they feel criticized, they may withdraw, sometimes dramatically. The withdrawal is rarely explained in a direct or accountable way. Instead, it may be justified through vague reasons: stress, tiredness, distraction, but the timing often reveals the pattern. The emotional impact of this is profound. Because intimacy is deeply tied to attachment and security, withholding it can trigger anxiety. You may begin to question yourself: did I say something wrong? Did I upset them? You may feel compelled to repair quickly, even if the original concern was valid. In more overt cases, sex can also become a tool of dominance. There may be subtle pressure to prioritize their desires over your comfort. Your preferences may be minimized. If you hesitate or express limits, the reaction may feel disproportionate, sulking, irritation, or emotional coldness. This shifts intimacy from a shared experience to a power negotiation. Another dynamic that can emerge is sexual unpredictability. There may be periods of intense pursuit followed by sudden detachment. This inconsistency destabilizes emotional safety. You may feel constantly off balance, unsure of where you stand. The unpredictability keeps you invested, trying to regain stability. Intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between warmth and withdrawal, is psychologically powerful. It strengthens attachment even when the dynamic is unhealthy. When intimacy returns after a period of distance, it can feel relieving, even euphoric. But the relief is tied to the end of punishment, not the presence of consistent care. Sex can also be used as retaliation. After conflict, there may be deliberate withholding meant to assert superiority or control. The unspoken message becomes, "You do not get access to me when I am displeased." This transforms intimacy into a hierarchy rather than a partnership. In some situations, intimacy may be initiated not for closeness, but to re-establish dominance after feeling challenged. It may feel intense, even overwhelming, but the emotional tone carries tension rather than connection. Instead of vulnerability, there is assertion. The partner on the receiving end often feels confused. You may sense that something is off, but struggle to articulate it. After all, sex is still happening. Affection may still appear at times, but the emotional undercurrent feels strategic rather than spontaneous. The most damaging part of this dynamic is the erosion of safety. Healthy intimacy requires trust that your boundaries will be respected, that your needs matter, that closeness is not contingent on performance. When sex becomes a tool of power, that trust weakens. You may begin to anticipate consequences. You may weigh your words carefully, fearing emotional distance. You may prioritize keeping the peace over expressing authentic feelings. This self-silencing can slowly disconnect you from your own desires and limits. It is important to understand that control does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks like charm. Sometimes it looks like passion. But if intimacy consistently follows a pattern of reward and withdrawal tied to ego dynamics, the relationship is operating within a power structure rather than mutual care. Real intimacy is not used to regulate someone's self-esteem or enforce compliance. It is shared freely, negotiated respectfully, and grounded in equality. When it becomes a mechanism of control, it stops being an expression of connection and starts functioning as a behavioral tool. And if you find yourself feeling anxious about access to affection, wondering whether it will be available based on how well you perform, that anxiety is meaningful. It signals that intimacy is no longer just closeness. It has become leverage.